Welcome back to Graf-X Tech. Today we're going to compare the 13-inch and the 11-inch size of the new M4 iPad Pros and help you decide which one you should get for yourself. The first thing is the obvious thing, the screen sizes, right? There is an obvious difference here. The 11-inch is pretty significantly smaller than the 13-inch, but is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Well, first we're going to talk about how much usable space there really is on these iPads and how much space you're losing with the 11-inch. And this should hopefully help you decide what you need to prioritize. So looking at how they view content here, I'm using this Avengers movie as an example of when widescreen movies are shown on your iPad, you're not getting a whole lot more space on the bigger size. And that's because this iPad is a 4:3 aspect ratio. So it is just not really made for this widescreen movie content very well. Where the smaller iPad is a 10:7 aspect ratio, which still obviously has some decent sized black borders around it, but it is more optimized for these kind of movies. And that is nice because you're not losing a whole lot of movie watching space on this smaller iPad Pro. So if that's mainly what you use your iPad for, and you just want some more portability, this smaller size is probably a winner for you, and that's really cool. So here's just a default YouTube home screen here, and I just want to show you. So in this case, there's a pretty big difference. You can see a whole nother row of videos on the bigger iPad Pro here. So navigating web pages and especially things that can take advantage of the height, because not only are you getting an extra row here, but you're also getting an extra row above. So you're basically seeing 4 horizontally and 4 vertically, where it's 3:3 on the smaller one. So that's a pretty big difference, a lot more content you're seeing. And imagine a nice web page with a lot of articles on it. You're gonna see way more content on this iPad Pro versus the smaller size. So if this is mostly what you use it for, is web browsing and just looking at articles and things to that effect, you are going to get more usable space out of that larger size by a pretty big margin. This is 4 apps open at once, which is as much as Stage Manager currently allows on a single screen of the iPad. And I basically equaled it out where each app has the same amount of space available to it, and this is equally distributed throughout the iPad. As you can see, the larger 13-inch iPad Pro certainly has more usable space than its smaller counterpart here. There is more in the Bible app here that I have open that you can see. You can see like another whole line or so, and the text is actually still slightly bigger on this one as well. You can see more of YouTube here. It's still open up. You can actually still navigate the sidebar where it completely cut that off on the smaller version. And I've tried to match up the freeform as best as possible. So these little post-it notes are about the same size on each screen, but you can still see this much more screen space around it versus just this little tiny window almost of freeform that you can see here. So I would say in conclusion, as far as the screens go, if you do a lot of web browsing, if you're really big into having many apps on your screen at the same time, the larger option is going to be nicer for you. It's not saying that you can't use the smaller iPad Pro and you can't do things on it. Of course you can, but the larger size is going to be better for you. And it is going to give you much more space to do those kinds of tasks. Also, using it in portrait mode, if you do like that wider feeling of the iPad, again, the larger size is going to be more for you. Because of its aspect ratio of 4:3, it has a really good width to it, and it's much closer to the size of an actual sheet of paper as far as the usable screen space than the 11-inch iPad Pro. However, you may not care about any of that, and you may just want the smaller and more compact size of the 11-inch iPad Pro. But does that small size impact its performance? Well, that's what we're going to test right now. All right, so for Geekbench, on the larger iPad Pro, it has 3692 for single core and 14589 for multi-core. And keep in mind, these are the exact same specs, both 1 terabyte, both 16 gigs of RAM, both the full 10-core processor and 10-core GPU. All that is the exact same on both of these. So it's just the size differences, where the 11-inch has 3714 and 14545. So the single core is actually better on the 11-inch, at least in this quick test, by a very, very small amount. And by a very, very small amount, the larger iPad has beaten it in multi-core. So what does this really tell us? This tells us that as far as this test shows, they're not really any different. They are getting the exact same performance as far as this Geekbench test is showing. And as far as metal scores go, on the larger 13-inch iPad Pro, its score is 532.73, and the smaller 11-inch is 536.21. So it's actually a little bit higher. But again, these aren't really large differences here. This is very fractional, and Geekbench's tests, while helpful, they're very quick. So they don't often show the more extended and thermal performance of a device. And that's where you might be most concerned with this smaller size, is how well does it distribute heat? Because typically, the larger the device, the easier it can dissipate the heat throughout the device. So something that might show that a little bit better is 3D Mark's tests, which they're more used for gaming, but they'll do really good about showing extended use scenarios. So I did a couple quicker, more like a minute long tests on these, and then I did one stress test on each of these devices, which lasts 20 minutes, and it really puts the thermal performance to the test. So first, we're going to look at the regular Wildlife Extreme Unlimited test that was only ran once, just to see their initial scores and how they compare to each other before we see how the thermal performance holds up. So the 13-inch iPad Pro got 8852 and 53 frames per second was its score there. Whereas on the 11-inch iPad Pro, it got 8585 and 51.4 frames per second. So already we see that now the 13-inch is looking a little bit better in graphics. But again, this was a short test and you can't learn a whole lot from it. I do want to mention that according to this test, the 13-inch did not lose any battery during the test, where the 11-inch lost 5% according to this test. And this is a short, only a minute test. That's a little concerning there. All right, the next test I did was a Solar Bay Unlimited test. And this shows the performance of ray tracing much more than its predecessor, the Wildlife Extreme test. So again, the 13-inch is ahead at 155.31 for the overall score, and the average frame rate was 59.1 frames per second. Whereas on the 11-inch, its overall score was 143.70, and its average frame rate was 54.6. Not huge differences between these devices, but there is a little bit more favor toward the larger size. And that could be that this one's thermal throttling a little bit, and it's not able to push out as much performance because of the smaller package. Although what's really nice to see is that the battery percentage did not drop in either of them for this test. So apps that use ray tracing are probably going to run even better on the 11-inch than apps that don't use ray tracing. So that's really cool. And the last thing I want to look at is this extreme stress test. First, let's look at the overall scores. So the best loop score, the time that it did the best on this test, was 81.48. And the lowest it did was 65.51. And it got an 80% in its stability score, which means it was fairly consistent. And for the 11-inch, its best loop score was 74.34. That's a decent amount lower on that as well. And its lowest loop score is 6,100, which again, decently lower. So by raw performance, the 13-inch is already looking like it is going to be better for gaming. If you're a gamer or you need like the best graphics performance, the 13-inch is going to do a better job. But by how much, really? Well, the stability of the 11-inch was actually better. It was 82%, which means it's a little bit more consistent than the 13-inch. And what's pretty interesting is that the battery dropped the same again for these. So they both dropped 15% during this test. So at least the battery performance is not seeming worse on the 11 inch, at least in any other test besides that one. So the lowest the frame rate got was 26 frames on the 13 inch, and the highest it got was 60, whereas the lowest it got on the 11 inch was 24, so it got a little bit lower, but its highest was 62. So its average is not really that different between the two of them, and that's pretty stinking cool. So even though the scores did a little bit worse, it does not seem like its frames per second is really suffering that much from this. So this 13-inch iPad Pro is better than 52% of other devices using this test. So that's a pretty good amount of them. That's pretty cool. That's nice to see on this one. But the 11-inch is actually better than 56% of other devices out there. So it's giving us overall a better rating compared to other devices than even the 13-inch. So again, you're not really seeing a big drop in performance here, and it does depend on what you're doing. It looks like the 11-inch does have somewhat worse thermals. So if you're doing very extended workflows and things that take a lot of time, the 11-inch will take a little bit longer, but not significantly. And it's really cool that they still pack the same chip in this, and they still give it the same screen, everything like that. It's no longer dumbed down in any fashion. It is the same machine, just smaller. And that is really cool to see. And it's great that there's not a big drop in performance. So the last main test I want to show between these two is a Final Cut Pro export test. And really quick, I also want to just show how the Final Cut Pro app is laid out between these two devices. So obviously you can see there's way more view of the timeline on the 13-inch iPad Pro than on the 11-inch. It's a lot more cramped and crowded, and the media pool shows less of the media there as well. Now, this is something that you can change. You can actually drag over the media pool if you want to see more of that and just have your view a little bit smaller. And if you're really working on timeline stuff and what's showing here is not the biggest importance, or you don't need to see the details, just the overall image, well, guess what? You can push up the timeline as well and create a lot more usable space and basically make this just a small little box in the corner. And when you're working on this, it's a lot more usable than what it appears on screen. And you can do the same here as well. You can resize this and make even more space. So yeah, you will get more timeline space on the 13-inch. But I just want to point out that you can adjust the UI to get more out of this app. And I have seen some people just kind of leave it as, oh, look at how much more space you get in the 13-inch, without really addressing the fact that you can modify the interface. So I do just want to point that out to some people and say, hey, it's not actually as cramped as it may appear to be initially. But anyways, we're going to do a quick export. So this is going to be a high quality export. It's going to use the Apple ProRes codec. So let's see how these compare. All right, so they just finished exporting and they were less than a half a second away from each other. The 11-inch finished less than a half a second sooner than the 13-inch. So basically they're both 2 minutes and 53 seconds. Not a huge difference there. Now they both have really good ProRes encoders and decoders. So I'm going to use a codec that in my past test I found out they're not quite as optimized for, which is H.264. So we're going to try that now and see if there's a bigger difference with that one. So the 11-inch just finished, and now so did the 13-inch. So the 13-inch finished about 7 seconds after the 11-inch. I also think I might have accidentally started it like about a second or two after the 11-inch as well. So I'm going to say it's about a 5-second difference between the two of them. Is that because this is the 11-inch, or is that just this time? But now I guess it has been 2 tests where the 11-inch has just barely beat the 13-inch iPad Pro. So something about Final Cut exports, apparently the 11-inch just really likes those and does great at them. It looks like the 11-inch iPad Pro is not going to have dramatic decrease in performance because of its size and thermal performance. In fact, it's looking like it's beating the 13-inch in several of the tests. So that's really cool to see. And I'm really happy to see that the 11-inch iPad Pro has not fallen behind in performance or any real capacity here. So next we're going to kind of talk about how the accessories and using the accessories works with these different sizes and which is better for what. A lot of people do view the 11-inch iPad Pro as more of the notebook-sized iPad and a little bit easier to take notes on and take to places for those kinds of things. And for the most part, I completely agree with that. I think it is a little bit more portable for those scenarios, and I do think it feels better as a notebook and in scenarios that require a notebook. I do want to point out though that the lines on the 11-inch are pretty skinny if you use the smaller lines in the default Apple app, where on the iPad Pro, they're pretty much just the size of college rule paper. And that's pretty nice, because having that more proper size means if you ever export it to like a PDF or share it with someone, it's a little bit more readable and it's not super blown out or anything, and that is nice to have. Otherwise, you're just writing even smaller on the 11-inch, which I can do, but not everyone is going to be able to do that very well. So if you're wanting that more full size, full sheet of paper, proper size lines and everything like that, you're gonna want to go with the 13-inch iPad Pro. It's way more properly sized for a sheet of paper. Even just the aspect ratio itself is better for that. And like I said, the lines in the default app line up to that perfectly. Now, you can offset this by going with a third-party app, and they can upload custom templates, all sorts of things like that. That is totally true. But when they export, it's still gonna look a little blown out and a little big for the proper piece of paper. So I do understand that there are other options besides, of course, the Apple Notes app, but this is what a lot of people are going to instinctively use when they take this iPad out of the box. So the main comparison between these devices I want to show with the default Apple applications. Although if you want to see which note-taking apps work the best on these new iPad Pros, let me know down in the comments below if that's something you want to see on the channel, and I can work on going through a whole bunch of different note-taking apps and finding the best note-taking app for the M4 iPad Pros. Other than the size of the screens and the lines, the Apple Pencil works exactly the same on both of these devices. You get the same awesome squeeze gesture on both of them, which activates your toolbar and all the things like that. You get the haptic feedback, you get the Find My on the Apple Pencil, which I still haven't used once on here, and you get the new barrel roll feature, which lets it spin and turn around as well. And really quick, I do want to mention, if you notice a little bit of a screen difference between these two, this is the nano texture screen on the 11-inch and standard glass on the 13-inch. If you're wanting to know what the differences between these really are and how the nano texture is best utilized and what it does versus the sunlight glare and all that stuff, I made a full video comparing these screens and comparing it to some older screens as well. So why don't you check that out? It's going to be linked in the description. And it's going to be very in-depth about what the differences between these OLED screens are. So next, I do want to talk about the differences between these two Magic Keyboards, as they are actually decently different between these two sizes. The first and most obvious thing is the trackpad size. And just the overall footprint of the Magic Keyboard on the 13-inch. It's a lot taller and longer here, which allows for a taller trackpad versus basically one that's half the size almost on the 11-inch. Width-wise, the trackpads are relatively similar, but the height is significantly smaller on the 11-inch. And remember, there are two different aspect ratios. So this is 4:3. It's a much taller aspect ratio in the landscape mode. Where this is a lot shorter in landscape and a lot taller in portrait. So that means as far as the width goes, they're actually pretty similar. This is obviously wider by a degree, but it's not hugely wider, which in this case, I actually think is a really good thing. That means the keyboard on the 11-inch iPad Pro is not hugely compact. The 13-inch does feel nicer to type on. It is more full-sized, and it has mostly full-size keys, still kind of half-size function row keys here, but everything else is like a full-size key. They feel really good to type on, and that's really, really nice to have. With the 11-inch, you definitely feel a little bit more cramped, a little bit more, but it's not hugely more cramped. The function row feels really good here still because they don't really need to be very big keys, even though they're a little bit smaller than on the 13-inch iPad Pro. And they obviously shrunk down some of the outer keys a lot more, but the main keys you'll type on are very, very similar feeling. And that actually is really, really nice because I don't feel like I have to relearn how to type when using the 11-inch. It's actually very, very similar, very comparable. And I think both of these do a really good job of maximizing the space they're given. And even as far as the trackpad goes, the 11 inches is definitely smaller, but it's very similar to the old Magic Keyboard trackpad for the 13-inch. So it's still not bad, and it's still a decent size for roughly everything you're gonna do. All the gestures work just the same. You're not gonna get any difference there, and that's really nice to see. So looking at the two of them here in their keyboard case, you can kind of see the footprint difference that they have. The 13-inch, it's definitely wider, it's definitely taller, but it's not hugely different. It is more tall than it is wider than the 11-inch. And there is definitely a difference in the weight of them in your hand. Like the 13-inch is a heavier package than the 11-inch. It's not a huge difference. And the 13-inch did get lighter in this new M4 version. But the 11-inch is definitely smaller, it's definitely more compact, and it's definitely more portable. I've seen videos of people be able to take these on planes, and they fit much easier on the trays that most airplanes have to fit your computer on than the 13-inch. And I also know from my own experience that I've liked to take my iPad to certain like restaurants and stuff to be able to do some business stuff while I'm there, or even if I'm meeting with someone for business related things. It's easier to show them stuff when I actually have something like an iPad with me. But bringing something like a 13-inch, depending on the restaurant, is just too big and it won't fit anywhere. Where the 11-inch does a really good job fitting into much smaller spaces, and I don't feel like I'm too cramped using it either. And it's very practical for situations like that. Although again, if you're a big multitasker and you need to be able to have 5 things going at once when you're on the go, well then this is actually going to be more frustrating to use on the go because of its smaller size. And you're going to still want the inconvenience of the larger size just simply for the more screen real estate. And it is a little bit heavier, but it's not terrible. And if you need that extra screen space, you're going to want to take that sacrifice of having a bigger and bulkier everyday carry. So what do I actually recommend for you to buy in your situation? Well, I'll start with the decision that I made for myself. I went with the 11-inch iPad Pro with the nano texture display, this exact model. This is what I chose and I picked out. This 13-inch iPad Pro will eventually be going to my business partner, and that's going to be his device. So for me, the 11-inch was the winner, but barely. And I mean barely. I love a lot of the usefulness of the larger screen, and especially when I do things like Final Cut Pro for iPad or other kind of multitasking, even freeform. It's really nice having that giant canvas to work on, and it is very helpful when showing other people and other things like that. But I've had enough times where I've wanted to take my iPad somewhere and I felt like it was too big to bring. And that was something I did not want to have anymore. I wanted to make sure my iPad Pro could go everywhere I wanted and needed it to go. And that required me to get the 11-inch iPad Pro. And like I showed, when I watch certain kinds of movies, I'm getting almost the same screen size while watching those anyway. And that's actually pretty nice. And I love this nano texture display, which is a whole other thing. And again, check out my other video on that if you're curious. And overall, I'm thinking this 11-inch iPad Pro is the one for me. I have not noticed any better performance on the 13-inch iPad Pro in everything that I've tested in these basically 2 weeks. I've always kind of liked the smaller size of a lot of different devices. I usually gravitate towards the 14-inch MacBook Pro, the 11-inch iPad Pro, and some smaller size things like that. Oddly enough, not for phones though. I'm always the Pro Max when it comes to iPhones. But generally, for this kind of range of technology, I like the smaller of the two sizes. I think it's because I've always liked to fit as much technology in a compact and portable and efficient way as possible. So I like that these are basically the same power and technology as the larger size, but they're even more compact and they're even more portable. I think that's super cool. The past few years, I felt not really able to get the smaller size because it had a much worse display than the current 12.9-inch iPad Pro. And now that has finally changed. I finally get an 11-inch iPad Pro that has the exact same display as the 13-inch iPad Pro. And that makes it so much easier to make the decision to go smaller. And I really do like this size option. And I love how it feels in tablet mode. Yes, the thinner and lighter design of the new iPad Pro makes even the 13-inch feel pretty good in tablet mode. But the 11-inch in tablet mode is just the sweet spot as far as using it as a tablet. And I do like to do that. I do like to take notes on it a lot. I like to use it on the couch and things like that. And the 11-inch is just better for those things. So I hope this video was able to give you what you needed to be able to make the decision for yourself. It still wasn't that easy for me. Like there's still gonna be things I'll miss about the 13-inch iPad Pro. I like the bigger size for certain things and the larger canvas for many things. But I can still do everything on the 11-inch and I can take it more places. And that's what won for me. Comment below if there's any other tests you want me to do between these two sizes of iPad Pros, if you think I missed anything or anything like that. Anything else you want to know of these iPads, you gotta let me know in the comments and I will make some more videos on them. I will explain and I will answer every question that I can. I really want you involved in the process of these tests and let me know what you want me to do and how you want me to do them. All that stuff is very helpful and I will take it to heart and I will actually do them. If you're curious at all about the setup that I use, it's gonna be linked in the description below. I hope this video was informative to you, and if it was, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and as always, have a great day.